The first bill on the calendar for today is House File 3489. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 3489, an act relating to education, establishing a field trip policy and establishing the criminal offense of grooming.
I recognize the author from Freeborn, Representative Bennett, who will explain the bill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and members, thank you for being willing to listen to this, and I'd like to give some good background to it as well. But this bill strengthens protections for students against sexual grooming. And I want to thank members on both sides of the aisle. This bill has been through 5 different committees and it was well received in each of those committees, and I thank you for that. And I want to note before I talk about the bill more that the majority of educators and school staff would never think of sexually grooming or assaulting a student. And I want to note that. But there are bad actors out there. And sadly, it's becoming what some are calling an epidemic, the sexual grooming of our students. Since the introduction of this bill, I have heard, from so many emails from people throughout the state saying thank you for carrying this legislation and telling me their story. I was even stopped by one of the custodians at the Capitol who had heard about the bill and thanked me. So it is a unfortunately, common thing, and we need to deal with it. Everyone knows someone who's been touched by grooming. So I'd like to share how this bill came to be, because I really don't believe it was by accident. Last fall, a reporter emailed out to a number of legislators asking for comments about a series she was doing on the sexual grooming of students. I happen to be the only legislator who responded to that. We all get lots of those, I know that. I responded to it, and I talked to this reporter by phone. And she shared with me the story of a young woman named Hannah Lepresto, and her story of in high school being groomed by her band director. Hannah was a percussionist, and she was eventually sexually assaulted by her band director. And as I'm listening to the story, I'm thinking, this is sounding eerily too similar. Because as a 10th grader, I was sexually groomed by my band director, and I was a percussionist, and I was almost raped. And I can remember clearly all the things to this day. It's been 50 years, members, a generation ago, and this is still a problem in our schools. We need to deal with this. So I ended up meeting with Hannah in my office, and I decided at that point that I would share my story, and I haven't shared it with many people at all. But I want to share it as part of an effort to bring this to light, along with Hannah and some other people, to make sure we deal with this issue. In the interview with Hannah in my office, and also Detective Chad Clausen from the Eagan Police Department, I listened to Hannah's story. I listened to the loopholes that are in our laws right now and the gaps, and I realized that we need to do something about this, and thus the birth of this bill. So let me tell you a little bit about what the bill does. It creates clear field trip supervision rules, stipulating that except for certain conditions, a staff person must not be isolated alone with a student. It creates a new felony offense and penalties for child grooming. It adds the conviction of grooming as grounds for revocation, suspension, or denial of an educator license. It adds grooming to mandatory reporting and requires enhanced mandatory reporter training to include grooming. It also allows the Minnesota Department of Education to look back further in their investigations than 3 years. It does have a fiscal component. It's a little over $1.4 million of ongoing costs. And the reason for that is that when MDE looked at their investigative staff and the numbers, they looked at other states that had added this grooming law and found that there was a huge increase in the number of mandatory reporter calls, intake people, investigations needed, enough where they need an additional 7.5 staff members. That is sobering. because it tells me that we need this bill more than ever if the reports are going to increase like that. It is a very real situation. There's also an anticipated cost for prison beds due to the new felony charge. I want to say I'm very proud of Hannah Lepresto for her bravery in bringing forth her story. Both she and Detective Chad Clausen have been amazing help, and they've done a lot of legwork. I want to share a couple quotes from them, but before I do, we have Hannah and Chad up in the balcony here, if you two would stand. And I'd just like to recognize them and thank them for all their work, and thank Hannah for her bravery in speaking out about her grooming experience to make a difference. Before we go into member discussion here, I just want to share a couple of short quotes from these two who have worked so hard. From Hannah Lepresto, my fellow percussionist. She says this: "Often when I share that I was groomed and sexually assaulted, most people focus on the sexual assaults as being the most horrific and impactful. But for me, the 5+ years of grooming were even more harmful to my long-term health and well-being. It was half a decade of psychological manipulation that harmed my understanding of healthy relationships, my own value, my ability to trust others. Grooming is not just a precursor to abuse. It is an abuse all on its own." And Detective Chad Clausen from the Eagan Police Department, who has worked on a number of grooming cases and got to know Hannah through this whole situation. He says this: "Grooming is the deliberate process of building a false sense of trust with a child to make a future sexual abuse easier. A teacher cannot accidentally groom a student. It's not a one-time event. Grooming is a process committed over years and can take just as long or longer for survivors to disclose. This bill not only establishes grooming as a felony offense, but it also works to prevent it from ever happening in the first place." So, Madam Speaker, I know there's member discussion here, but that is my bill, members. Thank you.
There are no amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File Number 3489.
Third reading. Further discussion to the bill. I recognize a member from Scott, Representative Bakeberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, thank you, Representative Bennett, for bringing this important bill. And I'd just like to say thank you to Hannah for her courage and sharing her story in multiple committees and frankly, reliving what she went through. Also, Detective Clausen for really rolling up his sleeves and making sure that that this important work was done. So thank you to both of you for the work you're doing. This bill really is about protecting kids. And that's something that there's bipartisan support. So from a school perspective, every day we have educators that are working with kids and hearing stories, hearing things, making observations. And there are times that something just feels off, that something just doesn't feel right. So we as educators are required to be mandated reporters. And that just means that when something is off, we have to report it. So that may mean that we report it to our county. It may mean that we report it to an SRO or our local police station. And those are difficult calls to make. But we're always trying to err on the side of making sure that kids are safe. And what I really appreciate about this bill that Representative Bennett has worked really hard on, and Hannah and Detective Clausen, are really strengthening those guardrails around field trips. So making very clear expectation around the field trips, what happens, and so thank you for that work. It also talks about breaking down some of the barriers between those notifications, between licensing boards, because I've heard stories about teachers or educators bouncing from district to district and not making it clear. So making sure, and that's what this bill does, that there's communication with the licensing board to address those concerns. That grooming is a criminal offense. It's difficult to talk about. it's difficult in those situations because, you know, some abuse you can see, there's a physical mark, but oftentimes something just feels off. And making sure that educators have training to identify this grooming behavior is really important. There is a fiscal part of this, and I'll be honest, my preference would be that the department just absorb this cost, reprioritize the need to make sure that they're doing it, and really focus on student safety. But we need to think bigger than just my priorities or my perspective. We need to make sure that kids are safe, and we can address that piece in the future. But aligning staff resources from the department's standpoint, focusing those resources, having clear direction that we are going to keep kids safe, and making the investigative process a priority is really, really important, and we need to be doing it. Because when I or any educator across the state has a concern, we have to file a report with MDE, and then MDE goes in and investigates. And that's what Representative Bennett was talking about, having the resources to be able to investigate those pieces. So I just want to say thank you, Representative Bennett, for sharing your story. Thank you to the bipartisan support for this bill. But most importantly, I want to say thank you to Hannah, because kids into the future are going to be safer because Hannah has shared her story. So thank you. Vote green.
I recognize a member from Hennepin, Representative Jordan.
Thank you, Speaker Damath, and thank you to all of the people who have been thanked already. They deserve it. So thank you, Chair Bennett, for introducing this bill and sharing your story, and thanks especially to Officer Clausen and Hannah for all of your work on this. This is a good bill, and I hope members will vote yes on this bill. This bill did come about because a reporter did meet with many of us here on the floor, and one of the things that I talked about that was so important was the need to do education to prevent this from happening in the future, which is why I'm glad that we're looking at the crime of grooming, but also talking about how to teach consent in schools, how to teach what grooming is, and make sure that we have health standards across this state so that all students can have these resources so that they know how to give consent, what that means, and how to stand up against people who are taking advantage of them. So thank you, Hannah, for all of your work, not just on grooming, but about keeping kids safe from sexual assault across the spectrum. That work is important and needs to continue. I also make sure that we're thanking everyone who has worked on this. Representative Ryer has worked a lot on this, and so has Senator May Quaid. So I'm looking forward to continuing to work on this. I think, members, that this is also an important bill to remember to believe survivors and believe women when they say that they have had experiences like this. Believe survivors. That's an important message. And it's something that gets lost a lot. And if people like Officer Clausen hadn't believed Hannah, if people like Chair Bennett hadn't believed Hannah, we wouldn't be here today working on this bill. So it's a good bill, and I encourage a green vote. Thank you.
I recognize the member from Goodhue, Representative Altendorf.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, members. Chair Bennett, this is a very important bill, and I'm so proud to see the bipartisan support of this House. This is something that we need to do more together to give the clear message that our children are off limits. This provides protections to them with the mandatory reporting. We are talking about difficult issues that have been difficult to address. And now, with the mandatory reporting, we are asking and requiring that this is not overlooked anymore. That is a very important step to our children's safety. Hannah, thank you for your courage. Courage is contagious, and in the end, our goal is to make sure our children are safe. As Chair Bennett, as you said, by far, many of our educators, almost all of them, are great people that love working with our children. Unfortunately, it also can attract someone who is a child predator to put them in a position to have access to our children. And so thank you, Chair Bennett, for bringing this forward. Thank you for your courage, Hannah. I am so excited to support this bill today.
I recognize a member from Dakota, Representative Ryer.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. First of all, thanks to Ms. LaPresto, to Officer Clausen. One thing that hasn't come out is that Hannah prepared a very in-depth and well-researched presentation that many of us saw with the statistics on how much this happens, and taking it from her traumatic lived experience to thinking about what's going on more broadly and saying, how can I make a difference? And to looking at statute and digging into our current law to say, where could the changes happen? So anything that any of us did, we had a great big starting point that we owe thanks to you for. It was good work. Thank you, Chair Bennett, for your work on this and for carrying this forward, and everyone else who's been part of it. One of the things that I was really drawn to in thinking about this whole set of problems around child sexual abuse in schools is how hard it can be to realize that something is wrong, that it wasn't your fault, that you didn't do something wrong to bring this upon you. And 3 years, when maybe you were a 14-year-old, maybe you were a 15-year-old, even an 18-year-old, isn't enough time to go, that happened to me. They did that to me. This was so wrong. And then take action. And so we need that extension of time to give people a chance to learn and grow and to heal and to be able to take action. I think that's a really important piece of the legislation. I'm grateful that it's there. The last thing I want to note is that this is a thing that happens to children. And so after I had shared some thoughts publicly about this, I had parents of young boys also come to me, and I just want to lift up that this happens to children. It doesn't just happen to girls. It's something that is traumatizing no matter who you are. And I just want to say to all of the survivors out there, keep working. People love you, people care about you, and you deserve to be healthy, happy, and whole. Thank you.
I recognize the member from Morrison, Representative Kresha.
Thank you, members, and thank you, Madam Speaker. So it's often been my experience that the legislation we pass here has been inked in the experience and tears of those that suffer at the hands of some of these terrible situations. The fiscal note alone demonstrates the need for this bill and the real problem that exists and the real solution that Representative Bennett's bill puts in front of us. According to the note, MDE is anticipating 5 positions for this, to go back and look over, I believe, a 3-year history, and to look at, they represent about 43% of the sexual misconduct investigations. Normally, I'm very resistant when I look at the MDE staffing request, but members, this is not a request just to do a report. This is not a request just to do grants. This is a request and to put 5 positions in to look at the very real problem of sexual investigations and grooming. I support this bill. As I've said in committee, I think that Hannah's testimony, her stories, will be more impactful for years to come over much of the legislation we will pass on this House floor. And for that, you can be very proud. Your efforts will go forward and save very difficult situations and save people from terrible tragedies going forward. And that, I hope, gives you great peace in a time when you're probably looking for that. So, members, I support the green bill. I support this with a green vote. I support Representative Bennett's bill, and I think this should be an easy green board.
I recognize the member from Cass, Representative Knudsen.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Chair Bennett, for offering this bill. I stand today not just as a representative, but first and foremost as a mother. I have 4 children that attend our public schools, and every day we drop them off at our schools with unwavering trust in the adults that we hand them over to. Like every parent in this chamber and across Minnesota, I place my children in the care of our educators with extreme gratitude. This bill is not about vilifying our great teachers. This bill is about calling out the ones that misuse that trust. Generally speaking, we trust our educators. Minnesota trusts our educators, and that trust is sacred. But trust is not blind. And today, we must acknowledge a painful truth. While the overwhelming majority of our educators are good and decent people doing heroic work every single day, there are bad actors that exploit that very trust. They groom our children. They isolate them. They manipulate their innocence under the cover of authority. And the damage that they cause is lifelong. Also, this bill puts more protections into state statute for students during field trips. When I was just a child myself, I knew a boy that was preyed upon during an overnight field trip. He and several others were drugged, and then they were abused by the very person that their parents entrusted to keep them safe. This teacher was somebody that this boy had been taught to respect, obey, and even admire. But being separated from his home and his family and being at the mercy of his abuser on this overnight field trip made the stress, the helplessness, and the terror of the situation even worse. The emotional and psychological damage that was inflicted on him that day was most certainly lifelong. House File 3489 does not accuse our teachers. It does not undermine the profession that we all revere. What it does is draws a bright, common sense line in the sand to protect the children that we love and the educators who deserve to work without the shadow of suspicion. This bill finally makes grooming a felony so that the slow, insidious manipulation that destroys a child's life is no longer a legal gray area. It ensures that mandatory reporters in our schools receive necessary training to recognize the warning signs. This bill is not about distrusting educators. It is about protecting the trust that we place in them. It is about saying clearly and without apology that our children's safety comes first. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I recognize a member from Mauer, Representative Mueller.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. You know, there's too often that our work here at the Capitol seems very dry. Let's be honest. Very detailed, in the weeds, something that maybe only a couple people can understand, and no one understands it and no one wants to understand it. But there are moments as a legislature that you'll never forget. There's moments as a legislator that you participate in that you know will have lasting and measurable effect. Oftentimes, they're in places where someone who has been exploited, someone who has been in a position where they cannot defend themselves and there's been a horrible injustice, we are able to come and say, how can we make this person, at least in the earthly sense, whole? There are times when you feel like you're put into a place for a certain reason, a certain space, a certain time. The Bible calls that being a Queen Esther, that you're here for such a time as this. I believe that Chair Bennett was put in that time right now. And I believe that many of us in this chamber have stories of past trauma that makes us understand the necessity of a time such as this. A time where we are compelled. It's the splagnizomai, it's in Greek, it's called that, this heart, stomach churn, that if you can't not do it, you have to do it. This is what compels you to make something that you know that if you don't do it, injustice continues. I've been a teacher for over 20 years, and I don't have any children of my own, but my students become kind of de facto kids, except for when there's that bright line, right? Learning about who they are, going to their events, super fun to be able to be a part of their lives outside of class. But you always know when to say, nope, not okay. You always know keeping the door open, making sure there's other people with you, making sure that someone's going to make sure that you are above reproach, because my parents decide that they're going to trust me with their children, and that is a responsibility that I do not take lightly. Because the words that I say to their children have effect. The words and the lessons that I say to their children could be carried on. I have people 20, 25 years later coming to me, I remember when you said. Trauma lasts a lifetime. And we as teachers have a responsibility to not only protect ourselves, but to protect our children and to protect our students. We have a responsibility to be above reproach and a responsibility to use the authority that was given us in a way that would be honoring of our parents and of society, frankly. We place great trust in our schools, and this is about making sure that adults are responsible. Because the power dynamic between teacher and student is it's very easy to be able to use that inappropriately. If anyone here has had the traumatic and horrible experience of having an adult exploit you, manipulate you, whether through physical or sexual exploitation, you know the importance of this bill. I'm part of that club, a club that I never asked to be a part of. And I know there's several others of you who have been a part of that club, a club that you never wanted to be a part of. That's why it's important for us at this time, in this space, in this moment, to protect children. Listen, you've heard me lots and lots of times talk about how agencies get way too much money and how so many times I wish that we'd be, you've heard me say no on lots of things because of reallocation of money. And there are over 400 people working at the Minnesota Department of Education. We can't do this? What are we talking about here? Core function of government, you invest in that. This isn't just education, this is public safety. We protect children. And while I hope that Minnesota Department of Education can look at all the employees that they have and maybe reallocate some of the things that they do, the fact that this has a fiscal note that it does means that this is just as important, because this is going to investigative work, is going into protecting children. Thank you, Chair Bennett. Thank you to Hannah and to the detective who was working with this. Your story I got to hear several times, and it's just as powerful every time I hear it. Members, Let's light the board green so we can protect our children today. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Discussion to the bill author, Representative Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I again want to say a special thanks to Hannah and Chad, because I really don't think this bill would have gotten to the point where it is today without all of their hard work and their legwork, and I appreciate it very much. I also want to say a special thanks to Hannah for your bravery in speaking out against something that's very private and personal. And you did it to protect all the silent victims that are out there. And I want to recognize that. And I also want to say, you know, it took you, I think it's been about 5 years since your experience when you came out publicly to speak about your story. And you're brave, because it took me 50 years. And it's not easy. But we need to share our stories. Because if we don't, then those silent ones that are still being victimized will continue to be victimized. And so it's worth it. So thank you. I want to thank all the amazing educators and school staff who work hard every day to educate our kids and to build healthy relationships. This bill is not about you. We honor you. But to all those sexual predators who are out there going after our children and going into our schools to create their own personal opportunity zones, I want this bill to put you on notice. We're coming after you. We're watching. Keep away from our kids. Members, thank you, and I just ask you to vote green. Let's light up that board.
The clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will call the name of the member participating remotely.
Momani Hiltsley.
Momani Hiltsley, aye.
Momani Hiltsley votes aye.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 133 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is passed and its title is agreed to.